The story opens on a rain-slecked Seoul street. Moni is walking home, her heart racing as she hears the rhythmic slap-slap of footsteps behind her. She reaches the golden doors of the Pyo estate, thinking she's safe, only for her stalker, Choi Min-Ki, to lunge forward. But he doesn't grab her. He screams at the armed guards. Check the service lift. They aren't delivery men. They have silencers. The Pyo penthouse didn't protect its inhabitants, it isolated them. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooked Seoul like a panoramic surveillance screen, yet they offered no shield against the shadows rising from below. Simone Moni Vance moved through the chrome and steel like an intruder in her own life, her maid's apron a thin armor against the cold gaze of the devil of Seoul. She thought the man following her through the rain was the greatest danger she faced that night. She was wrong. The monster behind her was the only one who saw the demons waiting in the lobby. Subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these stories to life.
The Pyo penthouse didn't protect its inhabitants. It isolated them. 40 stories above the neon-drenched pulse of Seoul, the air was filtered, climate-controlled, and eerily thin. Simone Vance moved through the chrome and obsidian corridors like a shadow passing over glass. Her maid's uniform, a crisp slate gray, felt like a second skin, a camouflage designed to make her blend into the expensive minimalism of Pyo Mu-Hyuk's world. In this house, the silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the high-tech security system or the occasional sharp click of Mu-Hyuk's dress shoes against the polished marble. Moni had learned the rhythm of the devil of Seoul within her first week. She knew that the scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco meant he was in the study, and that a single discarded cufflink on the mahogany side table was an unspoken command for its return to his velvet-lined drawer. To Mu-Hyuk, she wasn't a woman or even a person. She was a ghost that smoothed the wrinkles in his sheets and erased the traces of his existence from the surfaces of his home. Moni wiped a smudge from the floor-to-ceiling windows, her own reflection staring back at her, a black woman in a world of stark, monochromatic power. She felt the weight of her invisibility. It was her greatest protection and her heaviest burden. Out here, she was safe from the prying eyes of the immigration officers and the harsh whispers of the street, but the cost was a profound, biting loneliness. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the city in shades of bruised purple and electric orange, that familiar, prickling sensation returned to the nape of her neck. It was the feeling of a gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. Moni paused, her cloth still against the glass. She looked down at the street level, far below. In the mouth of the alleyway opposite the building's main entrance, a figure stood motionless. Even from this height, she recognized the slumped shoulders and the obsessive stillness of Choi Min-Ki. He had been there yesterday, and the day before that. At first, she'd convinced herself it was a coincidence, but now she knew. He followed her to the market. He waited for her shift to end. In the cold, clinical luxury of the Pyo household, the threat felt distant. But out there, in the rain-slicked reality of the streets, he was a predator waiting for her to stumble. She turned away from the window, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She preferred the cold indifference of the mafia boss to the hot, terrifying focus of the man in the shadows. Moni gathered her cleaning supplies, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of her bucket. She had to stay invisible. If she disappeared into the work, perhaps the world would forget she existed, and perhaps the man in the rain would find a new shadow to chase.
Choi Min-Ki didn't consider himself a monster, merely a collector of moments. From his cramped apartment across the street, the world was reduced to the circular frame of his telephoto lens. The rain blurred the edges of the city, turning the streetlights into bleeding halos of amber, but his focus remained fixed on the 40th floor. He watched the rhythmic movement of Moni's silhouette behind the glass, a solitary dance of domesticity in a palace of steel. To the neighborhood, he was a whisper and a shadow, the pervert they warned their daughters about. But in the silence of his room, he felt like the only person who truly saw her. He adjusted the aperture, the mechanical click echoing in the small space. He wasn't looking for a scandal tonight. He was looking for the comfort of her routine. But as he panned the camera slightly to the left, towards the service entrance that hugged the dark side of the building, the familiar gray tone of the concrete was interrupted by something alien. A needle-thin prick of crimson light danced across the brickwork. Min-Ki froze, his breath hitching. At first, he thought it was a reflection of a neon sign, but the light was too focused, too purposeful. He tracked the source back across the street to a nondescript black van parked in the mouth of a blind alley. Through the high-powered glass of his lens, the interior of the van revealed itself in grainy, high-contrast detail. These weren't the bored security guards of the Pyo estate. These were men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas, the matte finish of their suppressed submachine guns absorbing what little light remained. The red dot jumped from the wall to the glass of the lobby doors, dancing over the head of a distracted guard before settling on the service elevator's call button. Min-Ki's heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm. He watched as a second laser joined the first, then a third, a digital countdown to a slaughter. They weren't just following a target, they were clearing a path. He looked back up at the 40th floor. Moni was still there, a small, vulnerable figure moving away from the window, unaware that the wolf was no longer at the door, but already in the throat of the building. The world labeled him a predator, but as he grabbed his jacket and lunged for the door, his camera clattering to the floor, Choi Min-Ki realized that for the first time in his life, being the man who saw everything was the only thing that could save her. He didn't care about the Mafia boss or the millions stored in the penthouse safes. He only cared about the girl in the gray uniform who was about to walk into a kill zone. He sprinted into the rain, the hunter becoming the alarm. The rain didn't just fall, it hammered against the pavement, a rhythmic percussion that drowned out the city's usual roar. Moni stepped out of the lobby's climate-controlled sanctuary and into the storm, her umbrella straining against a sudden gust of wind. She felt the heavy gaze of the Pyo security guards at her back, men who treated her like a piece of the furniture she polished. She was halfway to the perimeter gate, her mind already on the quiet of her own small apartment, when a blur of movement erupted from the darkness of the neighboring alley. Choi Min-Ki crashed into the light of the gate's high-intensity lamps, his clothes soaked through, and his face a mask of primal terror. Before the guards could even reach for their holsters, he was at the iron bars, his hands white-knuckled as he gripped the metal. "Moni, get back!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with a desperation she had never heard before. "Inside! Get back inside, now!" Moni froze, the umbrella slipping from her hand as the wind swept it into the gutter. The guards moved with practiced, brutal efficiency, one pinning Min-Ki against the bars, while the other leveled a handgun at his chest. "Get lost, creep," the guard spat, his voice a low growl. But Min-Ki didn't flinch at the barrel pressed to his ribs. He looked past them, his eyes wide and fixed on the nondescript black van that was now gliding silently towards the service entrance. "The van!" Min-Ki screamed, his chest heaving. "The service lift! They're already in the shaft! Check the lobby, they have suppressed muzzles!" The air in the courtyard seemed to crystallize. The guard holding Min-Ki hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand moving to his earpiece to check the perimeter feed. That second was all the window the hitmen needed. A muffled twip, twip, twip tore through the sound of the rain, the distinctive, dry cough of a suppressed submachine gun. The glass of the main lobby doors behind Moni shattered into 1,000 diamond-like shards. The guard standing over Min-Ki collapsed without a sound, his blood blooming like a dark rose on his white shirt. "Moni, run!" Min-Ki's voice was a ragged howl as he kicked out at the second guard, momentarily distracting him. Moni didn't think. She didn't look back. She lunged toward the heavy doors of the estate, her boots skidding on the wet marble of the foyer. Behind her, the night exploded into a symphony of silenced fire and the heavy thud of bodies hitting the ground. The pervert she had feared for weeks was still at the gate, screaming her name into the chaos, while the devil of Seoul slept 40 floors above, oblivious to the fact that his fortress had just become a tomb. Moni slammed her shoulder into the lobby door, the smell of ozone and gunpowder filling her lungs as the first wave of assassins stepped out of the service elevators, their masks reflecting the flickering emergency lights.
The heavy lobby doors had barely clicked shut behind Moni when the world went into a violent, systemic seizure. The hum of the high-speed elevators, a sound that usually represented the pinnacle of Pyo Mu-Hyuk's engineering, distorted into a mechanical scream before dying entirely. Then, the light didn't just flicker, it vanished. Every luxury, every redundant circuit, and every glowing interface of the penthouse fortress was swallowed by a vacuum of absolute darkness. Parkdo 16 hadn't just tripped a breaker, they had surgically severed the building from the city's grid, plunging the vertical palace into a tomb-like silence.
Moni pressed her back against the cold marble of the foyer, her breath coming in ragged, visible plumes as the climate control died. Above her, the status lights of the elevators turned a flat, lifeless gray. She knew with a sickening jolt that anyone caught between floors was now trapped in a steel box, suspended in the dark. The silence was absolute for exactly 3 seconds before the emergency sirens began their low, mournful wail and the auxiliary lights flickered to life, not in the brilliant white of the estate, but in a pulsing, hellish crimson that turned the shadows into moving silhouettes. In the master suite on the 40th floor, Pyo Mu-Hyuk stood in the center of the darkness, his hand already gripping the cold steel of the handgun hidden beneath his desk. He didn't need light to know the architecture of his own cage. He listened to the distant clack-clack of magnetic locks failing as the security system defaulted to its fail-safe state, opening the doors it was meant to guard. He heard the muffled thuds from the service stairwell, the heavy, rhythmic pacing of professional killers who didn't need the elevators to reach the summit. Moni fumbled in her pocket for her master keycard, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. The crimson light pulsed, revealing for a split second a figure standing at the end of the long hallway. It wasn't an assassin. It was Min-Ki, who had somehow slipped through the chaos of the shattered gate. He looked like a ghost in the red strobe, his eyes wide with a frantic, analytical focus. He wasn't looking at the doors. He was looking at the ceiling. "The vents," he hissed, his voice cutting through the siren's wail. "They're using the ventilation shafts to bypass the hallway sensors. They aren't coming for the boss through the front door. They're coming from inside the walls." Moni looked up, seeing the slight tremor in the heavy steel grate above them. The building she had cleaned every day, every inch of which she thought she knew, had become a labyrinth of hidden threats. The elevators were tombs, the stairs were a bottleneck, and the very air they breathed was now a highway for the men sent to end the Pyo bloodline. She reached out, her hand finding Min-Ki's damp sleeve in the dark. For the first time, the invisible maid and the shameful stalker were the only 2 people in the building who understood that the fortress was no longer a shield. It was an oven, and the fire was already rising. The crimson pulse of the emergency lights transformed the penthouse into a rhythmic, bleeding heart. In the strobe-like flashes, Pyo Mu-Hyuk appeared less like a king and more like a statue, his silhouette carved from the heavy shadows of his study. He didn't flinch when Moni burst through the door, but the sight of the disheveled, soaking wet Min-Ki trailing behind her caused his grip on his firearm to tighten. "Sir, please," Moni gasped, her voice barely audible over the low, thrumming wail of the sirens. "The security cameras are dead, and they're in the vents, but he knows where they are." Mu-Hyuk's eyes, cold as black ice, shifted to Min-Ki. To the boss, this man was a stain on the neighborhood, a creature of the gutter. "You," Mu-Hyuk rasped, the word a death sentence. "Why should I listen to a rat who spends his nights hiding in bushes?" Min-Ki didn't shrink back. The panic that had consumed him at the gate had been replaced by a strange, clinical lucidity. The months he had spent obsessively documenting every angle of this building, tracking the shift changes of the guards, the thermal leakage from the server rooms, and the specific timing of the automated blinds, had mapped the estate in his mind with a precision no blueprint could match. "Because your architect built this place to be seen, not to be defended," Min-Ki said, his voice eerily steady. He pointed toward the heavy mahogany ceiling. "The HVAC system has a 3-degree bend above the master suite. It's a blind spot for the internal motion sensors. Right now, 3 men are crawling through the secondary intake. They'll drop into this room in 90 seconds. He moved to Mu-Hyuk's desk, scrawling a jagged line onto a stray piece of stationery. "The service elevator isn't stuck. It was manually overridden from the basement. But they forgot the trash chute. It has a separate hydraulic line that doesn't run through the main grid. It's the only way down that they aren't watching." Mu-Hyuk stared at the crude drawing. It was a map of his own vulnerabilities, traced by the hand of a man he despised. For the first time, the Mafia boss felt the prickle of true vulnerability. His elite mercenaries were dying in the lobby because they relied on tech. The pervert was surviving because he relied on obsession. "If you're wrong," Mu-Hyuk whispered, leveling the gun at Min-Ki's forehead, "you die first." "If I'm wrong," Min-Ki replied, looking up at the vent as a faint metallic scraping sound began to echo from above. "We're all already dead." The sound grew louder, the rhythmic sliding of tactical gear against galvanized steel. Mu-Hyuk adjusted his stance, no longer looking at Min-Ki as a predator looks at prey, but as a general looks at a scout. The hierarchy of Seoul had vanished in the dark. There was only the maid who knew the tunnels, the stalker who knew the shadows, and the devil who had to trust them both to see the morning. The transition from the opulent study to the skeletal infrastructure of the building felt like stepping into the belly of a beast. Moni led the way, her small flashlight cutting a narrow, dusty path through the darkness of the maintenance corridor. Behind her, the heavy, rhythmic breathing of Pyo Mu-Hyuk and the light, frantic footsteps of Min-Ki created a strange cadence of survival. For months, Moni had scrubbed these concrete floors and dusted these industrial pipes, treating them as the invisible veins of a world she didn't belong to. Now, those very veins were the only things keeping them ahead of the scalpel. "The main service shaft is too exposed," Moni whispered, her voice tight but steady. She stopped before a narrow, unassuming steel door tucked behind a massive climate control unit. "There's a secondary linen chute. It's tight, and it hasn't been used since the renovation, but it bypasses the floor sensors in the main hall." Mu-Hyuk looked at the cramped opening, his expensive silk suit already ruined by the soot and grease of the crawlspace. He was a man accustomed to wide-open spaces and absolute control, yet here he was, following a maid into a hole in the wall. He gripped his firearm, his knuckles white. "If they have heat signatures, they'll find us in the metal," he muttered. "No," Min-Ki interrupted, his eyes darting to the steam pipes running overhead. "The laundry lines run parallel to the steam pipes. The heat from the boilers creates a thermal wash. As long as we stay in the chute, we're just a blur on their screens. To them, we're just part of the building's exhaust." They began the descent. It was a world of steel and silk, the cold, uncompromising metal of the chute pressing against the fine fabric of Mu-Hyuk's status. Moni moved with a practiced fluidity, knowing exactly where the rusted bolts protruded and where the ledge narrowed. She was no longer a ghost in the halls. She was the navigator of a subterranean labyrinth. The sound of the hitman above grew muffled, replaced by the industrial groan of the building settling into its forced slumber. Every time Mu-Hyuk's shoes scraped against the metal, he winced, his eyes darting upward. He realized then that his power, his money, and his reputation were useless in the dark. In this space, Moni was the authority. She was the one who knew the secrets of the silk world above because she was the one who kept it clean. They reached a junction where the chute met the trash compactor, a dead end for most, but for Moni, it was a gateway. She reached into a recessed panel, pulling a manual lever she discovered while hiding from a particularly foul-tempered housekeeper months ago. The wall groaned open, revealing a path towards the lower levels. They were moving through the heart of the fortress, invisible and silent, while the hunters above fruitlessly searched the shadows for a king who had learned to become a ghost. The heavy iron door at the end of the maintenance tunnel groaned, protesting as Mu-Hyuk forced it open. They emerged into the sub-basement's electrical hub, a cavernous room filled with the rhythmic thrum of dormant transformers. The crimson emergency strobes were thinner here, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to dance against the concrete walls. Moni led them towards the secondary exit, but the air suddenly shifted, a sharp metallic scent cutting the smell of damp earth and oil. "Wait," Min-Ki whispered, his hand catching on a loose wire. He tilted his head, his voyeur's instinct screaming. The vibration in the floor. Someone is coming from the loading dock. Before Mu-Hyuk could pivot, the darkness at the far end of the room dissolved into muzzle flashes. A lone assassin, separated from the main unit, but twice as lethal, had been waiting in the blind spot of the generator. The first volley of suppressed fire shredded a row of plastic conduits, showering Min-Ki in sparks. Terrified, the younger man stumbled, his foot catching on a heavy power cable. He went down hard, sliding across the slick floor directly into the killer's line of sight. The hitman stepped into the light, his tactical goggles glowing like a predator's eyes. He leveled his weapon at Min-Ki's chest. In that fraction of a second, the social order of Seoul dictated that Min-Ki was expendable, a nuisance to be discarded. But Mu-Hyuk didn't move like a man protecting his status. He moved like a man protecting an asset. Mu-Hyuk lunged from behind the transformer, his body a blur of ruined silk and focused violence. He didn't just fire, he orchestrated a counterattack, his first shot taking the assassin in the shoulder to ruin his aim, the second finding the gap in the man's ballistic vest. As the hitman crumpled, Mu-Hyuk stood over the shivering Min-Ki, his chest heaving, the barrel of his gun still smoking. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Mu-Hyuk reached down, his large, scarred hand grabbing Min-Ki's collar and hauling him to his feet with a gruff, unsentimental jerk. He didn't offer an apology, but he didn't let go until he was sure Min-Ki's legs would hold him. "You're too loud when you fall," Mu-Hyuk rasped, his voice devoid of his usual condescension. He adjusted his grip on his weapon, his eyes meeting Min-Ki's for a long, silent beat. "But you were right about the loading dock. Keep your eyes open. I can't pay my debts to a dead man." Moni watched them, her heart hammering against her ribs. The devil of Seoul had just bled for a man he'd wanted to kill an hour ago. The debt had shifted. It was no longer just about survival. It was about a begrudging respect forged in the dark, a recognition that in this tomb of chrome and blood, the stalker's eyes were just as valuable as the boss's bullets. They moved together now, a tighter unit, slipping back into the shadows as the distant sound of Park Do-sik's reinforcements echoed from the floors above.
The return to the 40th floor was a journey into a neon-lit purgatory. As the private elevator, powered by the manual override Min-Ki had discovered, hissed open, the penthouse living room revealed itself in sharp, violent bursts of high-contrast color. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the lightning from the storm outside, while the internal emergency strobes bathed the chrome furniture in a rhythmic, bleeding red. Standing in the center of the vast space, framed by the city skyline, was Park Do-sik. He looked less like a businessman and more like a vulture, his silhouette flanked by his remaining elite guards. "You've grown fond of the dirt, Mu-Hyuk," Do-sik's voice rasped, cutting through the low whine of the wind against the glass. "Hiding in the vents with servants and street rats. It's a pathetic end for the devil of Seoul." Mu-Hyuk stepped out of the lift, his posture unyielding despite the ruined state of his suit. He didn't look at the guns leveled at his chest. He looked at Moni and Min-Ki, who remained in the shadows of the foyer. The plan was a desperate gamble, a fusion of mafia brutality and a maid's intimate knowledge of the room's hidden mechanics. "The only thing pathetic, Do-sik, is that you didn't realize who truly runs this house," Mu-Hyuk replied. That was the signal. Moni didn't reach for a gun. She reached for the console hidden behind a decorative marble pillar, the master control for the floor's industrial-grade cleaning and fire suppression systems. With a sharp twist of a manual valve, she bypassed the digital locks. A hiss of pressurized CO2 erupted from the floor vents, creating a thick white fog that swirled around the assassin's legs, obscuring their sight. Simultaneously, Min-Ki triggered the high-intensity architectural spotlights he had rewired in the sub-basement. The room exploded into a blinding, strobe-lit chaos. The hitmen fired blindly into the mist, their bullets shattering expensive crystal vases and tearing through leather upholstery. But Mu-Hyuk moved with the certainty of a man who knew exactly where every piece of furniture was placed. Using the voyeur's map Min-Ki had etched into his mind, Mu-Hyuk flanked the guards. The final stand was a symphony of shadows. Moni used the heavy industrial floor polisher as a barricade, sliding it across the slick marble to trip the lead assassin, while Mu-Hyuk engaged Do-sik in a brutal, close-quarter struggle. The high-contrast lighting caught the flash of steel and the spray of glass as a stray bullet shattered a window, letting the howling wind and rain scream into the room. In the end, it was the invisible Maid who delivered the turning point, hurling a canister of concentrated floor solvent into the path of the final guard, blinding him long enough for Mu-Hyuk to secure the room. As the fog cleared and the emergency light stabilized into a steady, somber amber, the hierarchy of the Pyle Empire lay in ruins, leaving only the unlikely trio standing amidst the wreckage of a billion-dollar tomb. The morning sun broke over Seoul not with a celebratory glare, but with a pale, cleansing light that filtered through the jagged holes in the penthouse windows. The rain had stopped, leaving the city below washed in a fragile silver mist. Inside the wreckage of the 40th floor, the air was heavy with the smell of spent gunpowder and the ozone of fried electronics. Pyo Mu-Hyuk stood by the shattered glass, the wind tugging at his blood-stained shirt as he watched his remaining syndicates gather in the courtyard below. They were the men who had stayed in the armored vans, while the invisible staff bled in the halls. Mu-Hyuk turned back to the room, his gaze landing on Moni and Min-Ki. They sat on a soot-stained velvet sofa, two survivors who looked entirely out of place amidst the debris of a criminal empire. Moni was methodically wrapping a clean linen napkin around a cut on Min-Ki's hand, her movements as precise and careful as if she were still tending to the house's fine china.
The hierarchy that had defined their lives 24 hours ago had been incinerated in the fire of the siege. The men who were paid to protect me failed, Mu-Hyuk said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried more weight than a shout. They relied on cameras and Kevlar. They didn't see the wolf because they were too busy looking at the throne. He stepped toward them, his shadow stretching long across the marble floor. He didn't offer a traditional apology, men like him rarely did, but he reached into the pocket of his ruined jacket and pulled out a set of heavy, gold-plated keys. He placed them on the table in front of Min-Ki. You won't be watching from an alley anymore. My security division needs eyes that don't blink when the power goes out. You start today as my chief of intelligence. Your record is gone. In the eyes of the law, Choi Min-Ki died last night. Then he turned to Moni. The cold indifference that had once defined his gaze was replaced by something approaching reverence. And you, Simone, you were a ghost in this house, and I was blind to the person keeping it together. He gestured to the vast ruined estate. I am moving my operations to a smaller, more secure location. I don't need a maid there. I need a partner who knows how to navigate the tunnels when the lights fail. You will manage the estate's logistics, all of it. You are no longer invisible. Moni looked at the keys, then up at the man who was no longer just her employer, but a man who owed her his life. The devil of Seoul had been humanized by the very people he had ignored. As the first sirens of the cleanup crews echoed from the street, a new kind of watch was established. The outcasts had become the inner circle, and the fortress was no longer built on stone and steel, but on a debt of blood that could never be repaid. The cycle of inherited violence had been broken, replaced by a legacy of the seen and the seeing.